except for I want to talk as little as possible and then actually hear from people on the call in terms of questions that they may have or ideas that they want to discuss. I definitely want this to be as interactive as possible. You are all students or used to be students. You've had lectures enough in your lifetime. You don't need one more. So I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm Tristan Taylor, born and raised in the city of Detroit. Uh, I am one of the co-founders of Detroit Will Breathe, which is an organization that formed in the heat of last year's uprising against the police murder of George Floyd and systemic racism and inequality that permeates our society. I'm a person who's been politically active since I was 18, actually 17, when I went to high school in Detroit. And part of what engaged me in activism was the ways in which I understood the opportunities that were supposed to be afforded to me and the reality of my access to those opportunities being very contradictory and lacking. And so it's always been a goal of mine, to fight not only for like the equality of people, Black people, oppressed people, working class people, but really for their humanity and their ability to be treated as such, which includes, a holistic approach as to how people become people and like what we can do to increase the health and life living standards or quality of life of individuals, and the ways in which systemic racism and inequality means a constant attack on people's right to have a quality of life that is worth speaking of. So the thing that I will say before I shut up and just open the floor is that Detroit Will Breathe came into existence because what we saw in the midst of the uprising was a conflict between genuine forces, directly from communities of color and people, from the suburbs who were genuinely trying to figure out ways to actually address and tackle racism with, so-called community forces who were looking to actually act on behalf of the status quo. For example, in the beginning of the protests, there's was always this conversation of like who speaks for Detroit. And it was so funny how the media and the politicians always found people who spoke for Detroit who happened to also be on their payroll or who happened to also be a part of their campaign efforts, who also happened to promote the ideas of kind of respectability politics of the movement, ensuring that people's righteous anger wasn't fully expressed. And because that perspective by those so-called community leaders who work on behalf of politicians and the state ran counter to what the needs were of Black and brown people across this nation who needed to be disruptive and express their anger because that's the only way, and that's always been the only way justice is obtained, to be able to do that, but also have the space to fully flush what that would mean. So in order to give the movement its own voice, free of politicians and free of state interference, Detroit Will Breathe was created as a way of trying to start a process of the Black and brown communities themselves, along with their supporters who are active in the struggle, taking full control of where the struggle goes, what the demands are, and how to address all the issues that come up with systemic racism, police brutality just being one iteration of systemic racism. And so that's basically for the past year, what Detroit Will Breathe has continued to do and try our best to do with a lot of trial and error is to be that voice and to be that organization that can create the space for the independent activity of the Black and Brown and working class communities who are genuine about making like substantial systemic transformation. So with that, that's it. That's all I got. And I'm gonna shut up. And I know this is weird. You might not have expected that, but I just want to open the floor. Yes, and to see what folks have to say or want to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. I think what I would want to know more about is the founding process of Detroit Will Breathe. I know you mentioned that it's coming from people who genuinely care and there's passion there. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about the organizing aspect and what that actually takes to, I guess, kind of market the movement, quote unquote, to get more people to join the community, join that effort, and maybe talk about like, yeah, like what it takes.
Yeah, I think the first thing that is important for people to know is that democracy is a thing that we talk about often, but often means nothing. And in order to build a movement that's in control by the people most impacted, democracy was really an important thing to make sure happened. And so one of the things that happened that we made into a regular process was to have open mics at the beginning of each rally. And we actually even proposed that the movement address issues and make demands that come from the movement itself, which meant, having the people who are participating in the actions actually democratically decide what direction the movement was going to go, what demands the movement was going to put forward, and how the movement was going to both articulate what it wanted and continue to deepen its connection with Black and Brown communities and working class communities affected by systemic inequality. And so it was really important to make sure that, and I think is not often the case, that when we have those moments where thousands of people are mobilizing, right, that those moments become a collective moment where all the people who come to say something actually get to do that. And that was a really important part of constructing Detroit Will Breathe. And it was also a way to have a debate between people who, presented themselves as grassroots organizers and people who were community leaders with connections with politicians, so that people themselves got to see those different forces argue and be able to determine for themselves who they wanted to follow or who they thought had the best idea or who they thought was more productive to engage with. So I hope that answers the question. I mean, it was kind of fly by night. I remember the first couple of days we had like meetings, one of the DWB organizers who's in leadership, he came with a spreadsheet of like, okay, here are the positions that like we have to create. And I remember saying to him, right now, the only thing we need to do is focus on like how we survive another day and how we make sure that the movement moves forward and that it moves forward on the basis of like where people want to go. And so it's been a interesting and wonderful challenge to continue to maintain the organization. But I think that that's really what was so important about the construction of Detroit Will Breathe and what will be important about building self-organizations for Black and Brown communities, oppressed communities, and the working class. That democratic process is really essential.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have one more question and then I'll shut up too.
Sure.
Um, you mentioned Black and brown politicians who identify themselves as part of movements or as part of organizations like Detroit Will Breathe, and they just so happen to use their platform to, um, speak on behalf of the community members that make that organization, and they are that movement. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what identity means, or like what you hope for, like specifically in your case for Detroit Will Breathe, but I guess in movement making
Mm-hmm.
overall, identity formation and how that propels or, like advances or hinders in other cases
Mm-hmm.
the goals of that movement.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say two things. The first thing is making sure that such politicians and community voices that assisted or were connected to the kind of politicians that were elected officials carrying out these racist practices of hyper surveillance of communities of color, right? Of practices of impunity by police officers, that they couldn't identify themselves with the movement or Detroit Will Breathe. So part of what it means to form identities is make it clear who's speaking on behalf of whom, right? So the thing about the democratic process, right, making space for the people in the movement themselves to speak for themselves and to also engage in the conversation is that it's much easier to delimit, right? Who's speaking on whose behalf or what ideas are being presented. Political independence was absolutely essential for Detroit Will Breathe. And so it was really important that we make it clear that this is not an organization that politicians can simply join or use to their advantage, that we were not going to become people who were going to be knocking on doors or campaigning for politicians, and that we were going to be a movement that challenged everything and everyone to be about what they say they're about, right? And to really put forward again in words and deeds what it is that people are quote unquote, representing. A case in point is there was a reverend who does a lot of work in the community who nonetheless wanted the movement to uh, go along with this racist curfew that the city of Detroit was imposing on the basis that this movement has to be, controlled and it has to be disciplined. But in truth, that racist curfew was a curfew that was imposed, that was attempted to be imposed on the movement to try to stop the independent activity and voices like of Black and Brown youth and progressives and radicals. And it was really important to have a fight, a clash with that reverend, and to make it clear that this space, this movement, isn't yours to just merely do what you wish, and that we actually will oppose whoever needs to be opposed in order to make sure that we're fighting for victory, and that we get to express what it is the movement has to say. Oh, and I see there's a question from Liz. Question is, what does your organization do in dry spells of awareness activism? How do you all re-engage folks? Ooh, good question. I'm gonna try my best, and please tell me if this answers your question, if you have a follow-up, Liz. But one thing that I think is really important for activists to recognize is that activists don't organize rebellions, or rather, when people collectively make the decision to act, that is something that they do kind of on their own rhythm. And the goal of organization, of leadership, is to make sure that when people are ready to be engaged and re-engaged, that we're there with all the tools that they need. And so we also have to think about what it means to engage with people. Right now, there aren't thousands of people on the streets, for example, right? The movement of last year was great, but it's largely dissipated. That doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't paying attention or listening. And so we have to find ways to engage people by continuing to have conversations. That's the cool thing about, having like ongoing campaigns, be they educational or political, in terms of follow-up around the demands of defunding the police, or fighting against the repression that some within the movement are still faced with, in terms of ongoing like charges. Like for me, example, I'm facing a number of charges from the city of Detroit and Shelby Township, which includes felony charges for protesting. So we are looking to like get people involved and continue to get people engaged. But to me, it's also about really preparing ourselves for the next moment where people make the decision of, okay, I'm ready to act, so that we can say, okay, now that you're here, like, here's the way that like we think we should go. I hope that answered your question. It was highly insufficient. So. Um, any other like questions or comments? Nothing is off limits, by the way. Like, ask whatever you want to ask. Don't be afraid to be, if to be offensive or whatever. I'll let you know if you are, okay? So Emma asked the question, what are some ingredients that take it from a moment to a movement? That's a really good question. And I think part of the answer to that for me is organization and leadership. Because for movements to become more than just a moment, they have to have ways to express continuity. And so what Detroit Will Breathe, as an example, attempts to achieve is to be that continuity of the struggle, even when people aren't out on the streets by the thousands. So again, when people are, we are, as an organization and leadership, who have been, thinking about our experiences, trying to draw further conclusions about them, trying to put forward political programs that actually answer the questions that people are wrangling with. A lot of times people ask themselves the question, what's the point of fighting? How do we win? How is victory possible? Building leadership and organization that concentrates on answering those questions allows for those pivotal moments to become a movement that has the ability to, again, have that continuity. And so, because we know, unfortunately, police brutality is not over, police killings continue to happen. And we've seen previous explosions around police brutality. There's no reason to think that we won't see any in the future. So to make it more than just a moment, having organizations that exist for that next explosion, so that we don't have to start from zero, I think would be is a way to do that process. And I hope I'm saying the name right. I think it's Priya. Curious if there are new thoughts, learnings that emerged for you in the past year. Has anything become clearer? Has anything felt clear before become fuzzier? Has anything that felt clear before become fuzzier? Wow. Y'all are asking really good questions, by the way. Doesn't make this easy. Uh, no, I learned so much from last year. I feel like I became, in a way, a different person. Because even though I've had like 20 years of activism, which ranges from dealing with issues around immigrant rights, around like affirmative action programs, around like defending public education, around labor rights. I never I mean, well, first off, last year was completely historic, largest civil rights demonstrations in the history of this country. So, in a way, no one was prepared for that. And it was a new experience for everyone. And trying to piece together that continuity that I just talked about, building organization, building like consistent leadership was really a challenge that took a lot of like, you know, both creativity in terms of how to approach it, but it was also helpful to have knowledge of like past movements in order to kind of anchor that activity of trying to put things together. I think the thing that is clear is the need for political alternatives to the two mainstream parties, and what I would describe as self-organization, which is, Black and brown communities, working class communities, oppressed communities, themselves having control over their movement and their organizations. And is it, but at the same time, how to make that happen, how to answer the questions of like, well, what do you do? How do you deal with the question of safety without the police? Those are tough questions that we actually have to have answers to, that we have some answers, but not all. And that's something that we're still working out. So I wouldn't say that it was clear, that it was like clearer and became fuzzier, but anyway, like the readjustment is what's interesting. Okay, and I hope that was helpful. Okay, and then Liz asked the question, how do you define activism? Well, what does an activist do? That's a really good question. And I think that there's like a range of like how that question is answered. Like there are activists who, don't fancy themselves like leaders. Like they don't want to be the people in the front. They just want to be the people who show up, who bring food, who like help donate money. And that activism is like really important and really key and really essential. Then there are people who want to take a more active role, like a leadership role, in constructing that organization that allows for people who just want to show up and be effective to do that. But for me, what it means to be an activist, and I fancy myself a revolutionary, because I think in the end, the only way you change the system is by pushing it to a side and creating a new one, is thinking about that process, and making that process something that people, like regular, normal people, can actually engage with. And that, to me, that's the activism that I'm focused on. Have you ever? Oh, this is from okay. I hope I say this name right. Tell me if I'm saying it wrong. So it looks like Blasey, but I probably did that wrong. I apologize. Had you ever reached to a point you felt you could give up? If so, how have you made it to keep moving forward? It's like Blaze. Okay, got you. Thank you. So like Blaze. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christine. Uh, uh, that's a really good question. So here's the thing. Demoralization is real. It happens. Is guaranteed. And you always want to win every struggle that you are a part of. And the truth is, you're going to lose a lot of the struggles that you're a part of, until, like there's enough force to change that. And I think that what kind of keeps me going are two things. First is the historical evidence that we have of people, right, in various cultures and civilizations and period of human civilization, always fighting against oppression. Like that's guaranteed. People revolt when they feel like their oppression is just too much. You wish that they wouldn't endure so much. You wish that their temper was not as long, or rather that it was shorter. But people fight. And the second thing that gives me hope is the fact that part of what it means for people to fight against oppression is for people to try to connect in a meaningful way with their own humanity and the humanity of the people around them. And I think that that creates an opportunity for us to make real progress. And the ruling class are not infinite. They're not the alpha and omega. They have faults, they have weaknesses. And because they're not all powerful, that means that the regular people, working class people who actually run societies, who are labor, that we have a possibility of overcoming that power if we do so collectively and in a really organized way. And I hope that was helpful. And yeah, that's all I got. So I don't know if there are any other questions. Oh, okay. And Priya coming again. How do you navigate tensions in movement spaces, either between folks that are organizing separately or between folks who are organizing together, but have different ideas about how to advance their vision? No, this is a really good question. I think this is where having space for democratic discussions and debates are like really important. And because people will have different ideas. And I think if we're to approach the question seriously, we have to say to people who have different ideas, how to think about those different ideas in a serious way. That means drawing conclusions on those different ideas, especially when it comes to putting those ideas into practice, right? Different ideas is great, actually, because trial and error is the only way you learn anything, right? That's kind of the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, you got to test it out, right? The question is like, how do we do that in a way that always keeps kind of our eyes on the prize, right? So if we're united in our determination to fight for full liberation, then that means that we have to find processes to go through, heated discussions at times with the goal of figuring out what the right way to move forward is, right? Because that's the thing that we have to be able to do when we are talking about different strategies and ways to move forward. We shouldn't be looking to prove ourselves right? The goal shouldn't be to be right. The goal should be to get the right answer. And the other thing that is important to recognize is that some differences will continue to exist because, again, some people, even though they say the same language and use the same words, have different meanings for that. And that's okay. It's actually okay that people have different spaces and different organizations to express themselves. And it's okay and necessary sometimes for those different forces to clash. Because again, what matters the most is getting the right answer and not just being right. And so it's really challenging, and it's something that I'm still like learning how to figure out. But I think it's really important to create a space that also engages with where people come from. Like in Detroit Will Breathe, like we have like an organization that is composed of people who have different life experiences, who come from different backgrounds. And so we had to kind of take time to even be like, okay, even basic language that we take for granted, like has to be like, really thought out. There's a question in one of the discussions that someone had about what does it mean to create like a safe space in a movement. And there was a Black man from Detroit who spoke up and was like, well, as a Black man, I don't ever feel safe anywhere. So when you say a safe space, like, I don't even know what you mean by that. And so it was an opportunity for us to be like, okay, well, how do we redefine like what we mean? And like, what do we mean? Like, do we equate struggle, conflict at all with a lack of safety? Or is it possible to have constructive conflict where you're fighting for and around ideas as opposed to around individuals, or personal, whatever attributes, attitudes. Sorry, there's so much noise outside. But yeah, I think that it was really important to be able to say, okay, like, how do we create a space that respects everyone and what they have to say, but also maintains a space where you can be critical of each other, and that not be like a breach of trust or safety. Um, that was long-winded. Sorry. I hope that was helpful. Okay. Thinking about the different groups, thanks, Christine, that are part of a movement, how do you decide who to partner with for the long term and who to join with for specific actions or responses? Again, these questions really good, making this presentation of mine really challenging, but I like it. That's a really good question. And I feel like part of it is thinking about what as an organization, meaning as a collective unit, your kind of short-term and long-term goals are. And given the fact that, again, it's okay for people to have different approaches to issues, or rather, there are groups who focus on different issues. There are groups who focus on police brutality, and there are groups who focus on, the right to like clean water, right? And then there are groups who focus on housing. The question is, how do we think about these things in a systemic way that allows for a kind of convergence of those different interests? And so when you think about coalition work, it is about thinking of how you're not asking people to not be themselves or their own independent organization or their own independent organizers, but like, how do you create a collective agreement around shared principles and ideas? And it really takes like a thoughtful discussion about what it is that people are trying to achieve. There are some people who think demonstrations, rallies, marches are really important, but are really invested in the electoral process. And then there are people such as myself who think that that is a flawed approach because of the limitation that it presents on, again, the people themselves having direct control of their own activity and what they are expressing and demanding. There's a way in which we can work with each other, but it's good in those instances to have more short-term agreements so that, you can work with people on issues that matter without having to kind of betray, like who you are, what you're trying to aspire to. Again, I hope that was helpful. Let me know if I'm not making sense, seriously, because I do that all the time, not make sense. So I can always try to clarify. Right. Hey, this is from someone who's anonymous. In your opinion, are movements meant to die down when certain demands are met? Or are they meant to be sustained throughout generations to make sure that the values of the movement live on? If that's too late of the question, how could you explain the things Detroit will breathe are specifically advocating for? No, I think when we think about movements, it's worth us thinking about what those movements are fighting for and the ways to achieve that, right? So if we are fighting against police brutality, we have to reckon with why police brutality exists and why it's something that this society seems really invested in maintaining and upholding. Because once we answer those questions, then we start to understand that what is required for us to seriously deal with police brutality is a more deeper and systemic approach of the institution that we currently live under. So we have to talk about capitalism and the ways in which it is a system built on exploitation and oppression. And if that system is built on exploitation and oppression, and it can do nothing else but give exploitation and oppression, for us to have generations that can be free of the limitations and the inequality that we face today, that requires us to think deeply about capitalism and what it means for that system to continue to exist, and whether that system continuing to exist is incompatible with the fight for liberation. And if it is, what do we do about that system? I think the problem has been that we've thought of issues like racism or like segregation or even like sexism as issues that require gradual movement because of the capacity of our society to do better. But the truth is, we've seen so many advances that have been taken away. And so we have to rethink what we think about movements and what it means to struggle against systemic inequality and oppression. And again, to me, that requires us to think way deeper than what we normally do about these questions, because racism is fundamental to capitalism. It is something that predates capitalism for sure, but has been instrumental in its construction. And so if we are to live in a society free of racism, that is likely to mean a society that isn't based on exploitation and oppression like capitalism is. So in other words, to put it in a different way, in the next 30 years, it's a question whether or not we'll still have a planet that's worth living on. We've got to solve these questions now and in a fundamental and direct and what's the word I'm looking for? But in a real sure way. And we can't just see these issues as things we can tackle throughout generations without having to make radical change. Like if a revolution happens tomorrow against capitalism, that doesn't mean that racism is over with, but it does mean that we get to deal with racism or deal with the destruction of the planet in a different way than what we have thus far. And what we have done thus far has proved wholly inadequate and insufficient in being able to address these issues in serious ways. So yeah, that's it. From Peter. What does it look like to be building something new, better as we tackle the issues inherent to the systems we live in? Well, the truth is we see it every day. Um, there are people who believe, for example, that liberation is something that is bestowed upon the oppressed by those in power. We talk about it as such when we talk about the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. We talk about it when we talk about the New Deal and the how great FDR was in doing that, without reckoning with the fact that FDR had to do that because he was facing a challenge against capitalism on a global scale, and that he didn't give anything he didn't have to give. And what made him give that was the oppressed, the working class themselves making clear what their needs were and even ways to address it. And that's true in the civil rights movement as well. So part of what we see, oppressed communities solve issues every day. And the problem that they have is the ways in which their attempt to solve their problems are actually interfered with by the state. And what it means to create something different and better just means fighting for that right to do the thing that people have kind of done since the beginning. I mean, you think about, there's a great book, I can't think of it right now, that talks about like the development of education in the US South, coming out of radical Reconstruction, and how it was radical Reconstruction, those Black people who codified in the Constitution public education as a universal right, based off of their attempt to create an educational system that actually elevated the issues that they wanted to learn about, that gave them back their humanity. And that was something that was a right that wasn't just tied to whether or not rich people felt like giving money to Black people to be educated. So anyway, I think we have some great historical examples that we can build off of to solve some of these things as we're fighting. Just a case in point, I mean, I think about like the demand for like a serious system to deal with issues of mental health, right? Or domestic abuse. I mean, there have been people who, for decades, have been talking about the need of social workers and how police officers actually don't deal with those issues. And more often time than not, like, for communities of color and the working class, like the police are the last people that you call to solve a problem. And so they found ways to kind of solve problems amongst each other. It's like, how do we like tap into, again, what's already taking place, and be able to expand and scale that? Um, so this is, I actually want to ask a question of y'all. um, and my question is, well, what are some of the questions and some of the kind of uh, challenges that you've reckoned with as a response to last year's demonstrations and uprisings around police brutality? And how do you think about it from the standpoint of the day-to-day activity and work that you're trying to do?
That's a really great question, and this is only a half-baked thought, and so
Okay.
I'm nervous. But
No, that's good. Bring it out. Come on.
I think the past year and all of the anger and frustration and the necessity to act that came from it, something that I've noticed and I think I'm reckoning with, like within my family, within my community, is that there's a big or like a large education gap, and like there's some ignorance and the stubbornness to not want to learn or not want to see another view or another perspective. And so the reason I have stuck around Globe Med for so long and I enjoy speaking with students and I enjoy this community is because learning is centered. And so, yeah, like that's my half baked thought that like education is something that we can uplift and spread more of, where there is like huge gaps in different pockets of communities that like are not reckoning with everything that's happened in the past year.
No, that was pretty good. No, that wasn't half baked at all. That was good. There's a book that I want to recommend people read. It is by this person named C. Van Woodward. And the book is called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Because you made me think about education and what it means to be able to engage and really combat these kind of different dominant narratives that maintain the system. Because the Civil War is such an interesting thing, right? We think about, for example, the Confederacy as being this institution that has these historical ties. They still have statues. And I like the recent memes that have come out that's like Outcast has existed longer than what the Confederacy did. And yet the Confederacy is such a big part of the American like story. And that is because for the kind of ruling elite, they were able to redefine what the truth about the Civil War and about radical Reconstruction was. And the book, Strange Career of Jim Crow, like talks about that and how like how that like took place. Because it's really interesting. Everyone's heard of or probably read Gone with the Wind. You know, it's this great American literature about, you know, feminism, right? And it is a terribly racist book. It is a thoroughly racist book that reimagines the actual history of slavery. And being able to like have people understand like that truth, you know, even or having people being able to be armed with like specific, you know, facts that they can kind of use against the ignorance that we, you know, deal with on a daily basis is really helpful. Because if nothing else, if we can cut down the confidence of those who are ignorant and increase the confidence of those who want to be better, that's the first and do better. That's the way that we kind of shift the balance of power in our favor. So.
Yeah, I'm really glad for that book suggestion. Um, I want to invite everyone else on the call to share their thoughts on Tristan's question about what they've been reckoning with, what you've been sitting with, maybe what you're feeling today, a year and some days, some months later. Um, and yeah, I'll hold some time for that before transitioning.
I can say a little something that's kind of related to what you were saying, Sarah. Um, so I think one of the things that I was reckoning with and am still thinking through was how to have conversations with people in my life white people, I'm white, and have conversations with them about, yes, systemic racism is real, and feeling very frustrated and not sure about like the things that people are saying feel so harmful that there's certainly an inclination that I have acted on to like call people out, but then because it seems like that's deserved, but at the same time wondering if that's the best way to like use where I am at to actually create outcomes where like maybe it doesn't happen in this conversation, but maybe if I don't call them out or if I say something else that's doesn't feel like right, but maybe if it's like less comes on less strong, then maybe like they'll come back to this conversation and not be alienated, and maybe that's yeah, so that's one of the reckonings I've been thinking through.
No, that's great. If I could respond just quickly, I know I asked a question to other people, but I just wanted to say something. I'll try to be really quick. I think one of the things that is worth reckoning with is the fact that what we are fighting against is systemic inequality, which doesn't come from individual white people acting alone, but in fact comes from the state, who has the authority and the laws and the power and the police to enforce this system that in truth, the white people themselves are no more individually responsible for than the Black people in creating and having say and control over, right? No one who works at Amazon, Black or white, had any say on whether Jeff Bezos got to go to space. And I think it's really important for us to reckon with that, because oftentimes what happens is when we need to be having these conversations in a systematic way, we end up being relegated to feeling like, well, we've got to have a conversation with every racist white person we can find. That is for the birds. That is not what we need. That is not what white people who are trying to fight against racism needs to do. The last thing you need to do is constantly make yourself available to your racist relatives or neighbors who are determined to not listen. The civil rights movement beat Jim Crow segregation, not because they convinced white people that Jim Crow was wrong, but because they gave white people no other choice. And so that book that I referenced, C. Van Woodward, was helpful and a guide to civil rights activists who themselves needed arguments that they could use amongst each other to convince themselves why it was right for them to fight, and why it was necessary and how it was necessary to actually counter the narratives and the talking points that white people say that they get from somewhere, which is the state, right? And so I just wanted to say that. So.
Okay, are there any final thoughts, any closing thoughts, or um, yeah, anything left before we transition?
I can answer. Um, I think what I've been reckoning with this past year is like being, tired of explaining to anyone um, anything, honestly. And also like I go to Howard. So that's like I feel like during that year where I was, because I'm a junior now, so I had the Corona year, but during the year that I was on campus, I was going from a very white space in high school to a very Black space, and then now like I had an internship where I was in a very white space, and like code switching, things like that, like after I would say, because I think this past 2020 was a big surge in, in like racial awareness and things like that. And after that, there's just been a huge feeling. I don't know, really what it's called yet, but it feels different being in different spaces. Like I'm very hyper aware of the different spaces that I'm in. And sometimes that's uncomfortable, even when you are with, white people that aren't racist. You're just very aware of yourself. So there's those two things. And also just like finding my purpose in movements. I think I asked the question, like, how do you, like, what does an activist do? How do you describe activists? Because I've seen a lot of like self-proclaimed activists and not really understanding what, and I don't, really even fully understand like what an activist does and what an activist has to give up. Because I think a lot of people, haven't given up what activists in the past have given up, or maybe more of organizers or teachers rather than activists. But since um, you know, activists, it's like such a umbrella term now. That's what they're calling it. So I think finding my role in a movement has been something that I've been reckoning with as well.
I really appreciate that. I'm sorry, I just want to respond to that, and I'll make it super short. I want to invite everyone to personally reach out to me and also reach out to Detroit Will Breathe if you're interested in, like Liz, trying to figure out how to answer that question, how to be involved, how to continue this discussion. We definitely are invested and know that like Detroit by itself is not going to be what solves the answer, right? Or like what brings the movement forward. That we have to have dialogue with each other. I will share in how to contact me. I will give you. I'm old, okay, so I have a Twitter. I don't use it. I have Instagram. It's pathetic. So I'm just gonna give my email and phone number because again I'm old and I apologize for that. Um, but Detroit Will Breathe is on all social media platforms. So if you feel comfortable doing social media, just get in touch with Detroit Will Breathe and they will like forward your, but anyway, I'll get in touch with you that way. But I'll give you that. And the thing I will say is like, what we have to understand is that this is going to be a collective process. I feel like so much of the time, Liz, being a Black person, being burdened with have to explain and justify our existence is like really frustrating and is exhausting. Like last year, I was like, I'm in California right now because I had to take a month off because it's just how exhausted I was having to do that all the time. Unfortunately, freedom requires that we do so, but it requires that we do it collectively and not individually. Not to feel like it's your job, Liz, to be a representative of Black people wherever you go by yourself alone, or that it's all on you to have the right kind of conversations with the white people who are around you. No, 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 no. That's not how that works. That is not how that works. And code switching, no, 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 no. Because if the white people can't hear you, that's their problem. They gotta adjust, not you. Like we gotta like start to make that like a standard that we get to be ourselves, and that means because there's enough books and academics who've written on so much of these issues for people to get, and they just have to find a way to get it. And we have to find a way to collectively be there for each other so that we aren't feeling like it's us alone, because that's no way. We'll lose and be demoralized every time. We need each other. That's the only way that we're gonna get through this. And I hate having to explain myself and my existence because that's what I do every time I speak in an interview. I feel like that's the question that I'm asking. Why do Black people get to live? Why do we not get to die whenever white people or a police officer feels like we should? But that's how we get freedom, is we can do that together. So anyway, sorry about that.
Okay, well, I am so grateful for your sharing, Tristan. Thank you. This was so inspirational and informative for the group that we are and the group that we have today on the call, and for everyone who'll click the live stream link later. Um, yeah, I we're transitioning, but it's the same Zoom link. And so I want everybody on the call to know right now that one, you can thank Tristan profusely in the chat and verbally if you would like. Um, but we are going to take like a 5 minute break where you can either keep your camera off, walk away from your screen for a bit, take a breather for 5 minutes. We'll rejoin at 5. Let's do 5:15. A little bit more than 5 minutes. 5:15, we'll rejoin this same Zoom link for a more reflective discussion, more specific to Globe Med practices and stuff. Still about movements though. And so, Tristan, you're invited to also stay for this conversation. But if I have burnt you out with this hot seat of a Health Equity Speaker Series episode, then feel free to take time for yourself while you're in California. And for everyone else, thank you for joining this part one to this evening session. And we'll hopefully see you in part two. Yeah, and that's what I have for right now. But thank you so much, Tristan. This was amazing.
No, no, thank you for providing the space for me to speak. And sorry, I won't be able to join part two, but I'm sure it's going to be a great discussion. And no, again, thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. You go enjoy your day. And for everyone else, I'm going to be playing some background music and setting up for the next session. So thank you again, and sending peace, love, and good vibes.